Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Saida Caballero, and today I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Penny Boston, who's the director of NASA Astrobiological Institute. And today we're going to learn about astrobiology under our feet and out to the stars. And I know this is a particularly exciting time for astrobiology. So, Dr. Penny Boston, please.
Thank you, Saida. This is lovely to be here. I actually was born in Florida. Haven't lived there in many years, but I always love an opportunity to talk to Florida folks. So let me see if I can smoothly and gracefully share my screen. Let's see, where's my PowerPoint? Now I don't see it again. Zoom. We just had this worked out, and now we don't. Let me stop sharing and see. I've had this problem with Zoom before for some reason. It doesn't show me the PowerPoint that I need.
Yeah, it's challenging in these times with all this technology. It doesn't always work the way we want it to. We promised it was working just 5 minutes ago.
It was working 5 minutes ago, that's right. Now it's refusing to find it. Let's see. Are you seeing my screen by any wild chance? Good, all right. You've triumphed over technology. All right, so I want to talk about one of my favorite things, which is astrobiology, and a second favorite thing, which is caves and the subsurface of Earth. And a lot of my own work is centered around the subsurface of Earth as we try to prepare ourselves for thinking about looking for life on other planetary bodies and even icy moons in our own solar system. So really the big uber question in astrobiology is, where is there a home for life? Where besides Earth can we find life? Can we look for traces of past life or even potentially current life within our solar system? And of course, also now that we know that there are billions of planets that circle the stars in our own galaxy and undoubtedly in other galaxies, the amount of real estate that's available to look for signs of life of some sort has greatly multiplied over the course of my lifetime. So my day job is fairly complicated. I study extreme cave environments. The image that you see there is one of our study sites in Mexico. It's a cave that is saturated in sulfuric acid, which is why we are in breathing gear and suits. I think about how to find life on other planets, as I just mentioned, by using the models that we develop to explain these extreme life forms on Earth as a template for how we go about that. I also have spent many, many decades thinking about how humans will actually explore the moon and Mars. So as I'm sure most of you know, we have done a lot of planetary exploration and a very tiny amount of human exploration on the moon, but that was very long ago. But now NASA and other space agencies and even private companies are planning on the return to the moon with humans in a much more consistent and major way than has been the case for the last number of decades. And one of the far-flung ends of my career is really wondering if we can, or even if we should, permanently transplant Earth-type life to Mars, assuming that there are no native Martians. If there's life already on Mars, then that takes it off the table in my view. But if Mars has never generated life or contains no life now, it is something that a number of people are considering as to whether or not that's an option for our species in the far future. So astrobiology, what is it? How do you study it? Why would you study it? And who studies it? Are really some of the critical questions. Astrobiology is a huge field, and this is because it's not a single science. It's not just biology, it's also planetary science and many other sciences. And we have a list of questions that really go right across this whole spectrum of different sciences. So what are the physical processes that happen in solar systems as they're forming that actually can set the stage for life later on? What are the processes that lead to the origin of life and its subsequent development and its persistence on a body? You can imagine a planet that generates lifelike processes, but maybe lacks some kind of circumstances that would allow that life to persist. And certainly as we look out into exoplanets, these planets that circle other stars, we're trying to figure out what is the probability of finding life signals on a planet within our own galaxy. How many of these objects might be worthwhile studying? And ultimately, what is the fate of life on a planet? We know that our solar system formed around 4.8 billion years ago. We're about halfway through the lifetime of our star. So we've got another approximately 5 billion years to play with for life to continue. And how will that continue on our planet? How will that happen? And then where do we go to look for life beyond Earth? One of the tricky things in biology that we don't have a simple answer for, and that is, what is the nature of life? What is the definition of life? And we have no clear, crisp, simple definition of life. And probably that's because life is not a simple process. It is material of some sort doing something over time. So it's really a complex system. And because of that, most of us have what we think of as operational definitions. If you ask any biologist or astrobiologist, they'll probably have a slightly different laundry list of the ingredients that they think are necessary and the phenomena that they think are necessary to actually make up what we would call life. It may be that some types of life use radically different chemistries. We don't know that. We don't have any examples of that on Earth, but there are theoretical considerations that lead us to believe that on some planets with really different environments to that that we have on Earth, that we would potentially have the possibility of life made out of different stuff or molecules arranged in a very different way than we have here. We have no idea really what the likelihood of intelligent life is. We are very hopeful that we will uncover that at some point. Presumably it will be less common than microbial level life or even other life that is more complex than microbial life. And some people have actually speculated that life-like processes might actually be attributable to some of the processes that we see in stars, in which case they might not be life as we understand it, but it could be a kind of energy-based lifelike process that would even involve material or matter. So the biggest task that we have is really analogous to trying to write a field guide like you would take out into the field to try to figure out what birds or plants or butterflies you were seeing here on Earth. But we're trying to write this field guide about organisms that we don't even know exist. And we don't know what their properties are. And so the way we are trying to go about this is by studying the extreme environments that we have here on Earth, by studying the fundamental properties of life as we understand it on Earth, and by studying other planets and figuring out what their types of environments and habitats that they offer might be like, and then trying to piece these things together so that we can develop space missions and other ground-based observations to actually go forward and seek this out. So astrobiology, as I said before, is really an intersection of many different studies. And in fact, I've only put the sciences and the engineering on here. There's also many other things. So certainly art and poetry and literature and humanities and what are our responses as humans going to be at the point at which we find other life. How will that affect how we think, and how will that affect our philosophies? So all of these things combine to make up this vast field of astrobiology. Particularly important, of course, is planetary astronomy and the earthly extreme environments and basic biology. But because we're searching beyond Earth, we have a huge dose of different kinds of engineering that has to go into the mix. Because even though we can study many things here on Earth, the ultimate quarry is to go to other planets and icy moons around gas giant planets in our solar system and actually try to search directly for indicators of life. So why is life hard to find? I am a lifelong science fiction reader, and I fell in love with it as a kid. And part of the reason was because my imagination was on fire, imagining science fiction creatures like you see on this slide. This is a pretty wild way out there, one by one of my favorite space science fiction artists, Valiant. But the truth is that we're not really looking for that. And we think that because we know that for 75% of the history of life on our planet so far, it was exclusively microbial. It's only in the last 25% of the history of life on Earth that we've had larger things. And by larger things, I don't even mean dinosaurs necessarily. I mean even the first coming together of clumps of cells that were living in colonies. So it took a long time on our planet for things to develop into very large creatures. And so just thinking about it probabilistically, we're probably looking primarily for microbial life forms. Well, they're tiny. And in many cases, they're hiding a condition known as being cryptic. And this is because if you are an organism, you are a lovely packet of potential food for other organisms. And so being able to protect yourself by living in the crevices of rocks or in slimy mats or in the water column of water bodies or perhaps even in the dense atmospheres of some planets could be a way to protect yourself. We also know that life on another planetary body might be really different in its fundamental chemistry. And we have to have an open mind about that and try to figure out ways to see if we can detect radically different chemistries. The structure of the biomolecules, as I mentioned before, and maybe even the size scale. So on Earth, the tiniest life-like entities that we have are viruses. They're much smaller than bacteria, but I could imagine circumstances when where a planet might only give rise to life in that size scale. So we don't really know what we're up against. We know from a lot of the work that my team and others have done in rocky environments on Earth that when there is not a lot of biological energy available for organisms, they can be very, very slow in their metabolic activity, in the amount of times that they can reproduce over a given period of time. Many of the microorganisms on Earth go into dormant states where they basically shut down and wait for times to get better. So it's really important to take that into account. And that's hard to do on space missions, where so far we have a very limited amount of time and a limited amount of power and a limited amount of instrumentation to actually look for life. The location is also perhaps another issue. And when we look around our solar system, it's pretty clear that the only really conspicuous life on the surface of a planet seems to be us here on Earth. But a lot of the other planets have significant real estate in the subsurface by way of being caves or rock fractures or fractures in the ices in icy moons. And so if there are other locations within our own solar system where life exists, it is not advertising it on the surface. And that, of course, is part of what we have to overcome in our imagination, and then translate that into engineering capabilities and missions to actually go seek for signs of life. One of the things that, of course, is a real issue always for humans as we tackle problems, and that is to be guided by our limited experience. So one of the reasons that I love science fiction is because within the fictional realm, authors have imagined all sorts of things that are currently outside of our understanding within science, but I think helps to keep our mentality flexible so that we can walk that fine line between total fiction and trying to ground these ideas about what might be out there in the fundamental sciences that we do understand. So I spend a lot of time in big holes in the ground, and I started that really in mid-career. I'm certainly very senior in my career now. I have been doing microbiology, astrobiology, geomicrobiology, geology, atmospheric chemistry, all sort of combined for going on more than 45 years now. So over that period of time, I brought many different things into my work. But really the astrobiology, which we used to call exobiology when I was a kid, has really driven me forward. And all those areas that I'm interested in that I just mentioned is really because my particular talents in science really lay in synthesizing things. So people have all different kinds of ways that they think, and science contains plenty of jobs and problems to solve for every different kind of mentality. So for me, I love to bring different sciences and engineering together to bear on problems. Some people love to study the heck out of one particular problem in great depth, but with narrow scope. And we are all necessary to the process of science. I have kind of a short attention span and a long attention span. So I've been working on the issue of life on Mars for these 45 years and counting. But I do a lot of different things at once. And so astrobiology is perfect for somebody with my mindset because it does involve such a richness in different kinds of studies. I'm also old enough to be the generation that was a little kid at the dawning of the space age back in the late 50s and into the 60s. And I put down Sputnik here, which is the name of the very first artificial satellite that was launched. And this was launched by what was then the Soviet Union. And we were engaged in this long Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we were trying to outdo each other in science and space. The good byproduct of that unfortunate conflict was that a lot of money and attention was paid to what we would now call STEM. We didn't have that acronym then, but in the science, math, and engineering arenas, we all benefited from a great focus on that. And that set the pattern for a lot of the way that a lot of us have conducted our careers over time. So I want to talk a bit about caves because a lot of people are not familiar with caves. Since I'm talking to a Florida crowd, I'm sure a lot of you know that Florida is tremendously rich in caves. I've done quite a bit of work in caves and water-filled caves in Florida myself. I spent a lot of my childhood in Florida. I was born in Florida. But at the time, I only was kind of a tourist in the caves in Florida. And it wasn't until I got into studying caves after I had already moved to Colorado and then New Mexico, that I really started focusing on caves. And there's a good set of reasons for that. One is, of course, the joy of exploring environments that offer a whole lot of things going on in biology and geology and mineralogy that you don't see on the surface of the planet. The caves themselves allow us to actually get into the subsurface and explore those things. So I think of them as windows into the subsurface of our planet. The cave biology and microbiology is beginning to be a bit better studied now. But when I first started studying these things about 25 years or so ago, there can't have been more than 100 people around the entire world that were really paying attention to this. Of course, I've already alluded to the relevance of extreme environments on Earth to astrobiology, and a lot of the cave environments that we study are quite extreme in terms of physical conditions. The cave environment is wonderfully preservative. So a lot of paleontological and archaeological remains are preserved marvelously in caves. So remains of animals and plants and remains of human culture and human technology and even human remains themselves have been identified in caves. And then the last thing that I really want to emphasize is that caves are very precious and a whole class of wilderness that requires our stewardship as humans. And this is not only for the science that we can do there, but also the recreational opportunities. I joke about looking glamorous at all times because the kinds of caves that I'm the most interested in are the ones with the most hot or cold or poisonous or otherwise uncomfortable conditions. And that's not just so I can dress up in funny suits. It's really because we're looking at the organisms that may be there that have learned to endure those kinds of conditions. And those are the ones that we're the most interested in studying. So when we think about what a cave is in a people's eye view that we humans think about, typically we're thinking about a hole in the ground or a passage in the ground that's big enough for us to get into. But if you're a smaller organism like a salamander or some kind of invertebrate, you don't require as big a cave, and very small pockets in rocks can actually provide protection for you, just the way a big cave can provide for us larger creatures. And if you are a tiny microbe, you don't need necessarily a whole cave at all. You can be protected from the external environment just by living in the pore spaces and the tiny microfractures that exist in many different rock types. So all of these are really kind of a continuum from very tiny spaces to very huge spaces, but all of them are the potential habitat of organisms. Currently, we know about 300,000 caves that have actually been mapped on Earth. But the estimates are that at least 100 to maybe 10,000 or even more times that many cavities really exist. I think the latest estimates are pushing that number even higher. And these are pockets and spaces within rock that have no current openings. Openings are created by a whole lot of different geological processes. And so that allows us to get into the caves. But the total real estate underground on our planet, not only on the continental masses and islands, but also on the seafloor, is huge. And that means that the total biodiversity of the subsurface of Earth, even though it's microscopic in most cases, is far greater than the total biodiversity of what we see as our biosphere on the surface. So cave environments have particular properties. Obviously, it's dark in caves, except right around the entrance. And one of the remarkable things about them is that they have very high humidity, almost saturated humidity once you get past the entrance area. And the temperatures can range widely depending on where the cave is, but in any given cave, the temperature fluctuation is very small. So from the point of view of organisms living in there, that's a very benign, kindly condition. And so that's a way in which cave environment can be much less challenging than the surface. But because it's in the subsurface, there's very much less access to nutrients, food, basically. On the upside, of course, these are geological features, and so they tend to be mineral rich. And so the organisms that I personally am the most interested in and that fit our need to try to translate this to astrobiology are ones that don't eat food in the way that you and I do. They don't eat organic materials. They actually get their energy from transforming inorganic mineral compounds. The lack of surface weather means that you get wonderful preservation, and that's why you get the preservation that I mentioned before. So not only are these great places to hunt for living organisms, but they also preserve traces of past life very, very well compared to the surface. So this is one of my very favorite examples. This is from work of John and Susie Pint, colleagues of mine. They live in Mexico. Susie is Mexican, John is British. They live in Mexico, but they spend a lot of their time in Saudi Arabia and other places in the Middle East and studying caves. And this is shows the background image is the Rub al Khali, which is a well-known sand desert known as the Empty Quarter that crosses a number of the nations in that area. And you can see on the lower left, Susie is looking into a hole in the ground. In the middle, you can see what looks like a very tiny person going into a very large hole. And so some of the entrances into the subsurface are tiny and some of them are very big. And even though this is a very hot and very dry desert and has been for the last 20 million years, these caves contain diveable pools. And you can see that on the lower right-hand side of the screen. And these are relict systems that contain not only microbial life, but in many cases also higher and larger life forms. And these are time capsules, really, from a time when this was not a desert environment, but much wetter. So this super clear contrast between what the planet's surface environment is and what a subsurface environment can be like is really very dramatic. So we think we know our planet because we live on the surface of it, but actually, except for those of us who think about the subsurface, we're only seeing a very partial slice of what actually is available to life here on Earth. Caves occur in many rock types. So for many of us, if our only experience is going into tourist caves, we are familiar with the fact that those are often made in limestone. But if you look around the world, there are caves in salt in the Atacama Desert in Chile and in Israel and in Spain and right here in southern New Mexico. And there are caves called lava tubes and lava pits that are made as a byproduct of volcanic activity. There are caves in ice in the Antarctic, but also even in the high mountains, the Andes and the Pacific Northwest, Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens, and even more rock types. So there are many geological ways to make holes in rock. And each one of those is, has the potential for being habitat for a whole set of different organisms. Just to give you a feel for how big caves are, they are relatively shallow within the Earth's crust. So the deepest cave, as you see on the right, and this is changing all the time. So from the entrance all the way to the deepest point in this particular cave is over 2 kilometers, and people are always in a race to try to push deeper and deeper, but that's about the range, about 1.25 miles right now. The deepest mine, on the other hand, is well over 2.5 miles, and this is because humans are using technology to actually get down that far. But when you think that the Earth's crust is around 30 kilometers deep, you can see that this is deep to us, but still relatively shallow within the Earth itself. However, there are a lot of really long caves, and Mammoth Cave in Kentucky holds the world record right now, well over 550 kilometers, about 350 miles. There's the potential that 2 other caves will hook up with this one at some point, and that will really extend the length of this. Caves made in the rock gypsum. If you're not familiar with gypsum, it's a very common building material. The wallboard that you see that many rooms are lined with, that's gypsum, calcium sulfate. And there are caves in beautiful gypsum deposits, and some of the longest ones are in the Ukraine, several hundred kilometers. There are lava tubes on Earth. Many of them are quite long. Kazumura is the longest one. And then there are caves that very often are near seacoasts, either in Caribbean islands or Mexico or Indonesia, Australia. And sea level has risen and lowered over time. And because of that, a lot of these caves have been made in at the water-air interface and then inundated with water, or sometimes when the sea level drops very dramatically over geological time, then they get left high and dry, and this cycle continues on and on. So I want to quickly whip through just the basics of cave life. The picture that you see here, all that drippy gooey stuff is coming off these beautiful gypsum crystals. This is in Villaluz in Tabasco in Mexico, and this is the sulfuric acid containing cave that I mentioned earlier. All that drippy stuff is made by bacteria that are living at extreme acid conditions. The pH scale, for those of you not familiar with it, is a way that we measure how acid or how neutral or how alkaline something is. These guys are at absolute 0 in many cases, which is the very bottom end of the pH scale, meaning that they're extremely hyperacid. And yet they're happy making their living in those circumstances. There are organisms that just visit. So this is one of my favorite pictures by a friend and colleague of mine, Diana Northup. Very often ladybugs and many other creatures will just visit a cave for protection, maybe to get out of the heat, or in this case, this is a mating swarm of ladybugs. So they just visit. There are things like cave crickets that you see in the upper right-hand image. These guys live in caves and they reproduce in caves, but they come out at night to forage for food on the surface above the cave. There are permanent residents, like the weird white fishy that you see in the lower left. And this is highly adapted. It has no pigment in its skin anymore, doesn't need it in the cave. It has no eyes, and it has a whole set of different behaviors that fit it to live in a cave. There are creatures like bats who use caves during the year, sometimes all year, sometimes just for hibernation, sometimes just to have and raise their babies. So there are all different ways that creatures who are in the animal groups use this. Part of the reason for this, of course, is the adaptations that they develop where they save energy by not doing things like producing pigments. So animals use pigments for all different, and in fact, plants do too, for all different purposes. The millipede on the lower left is poisonous, and it's advertising that fact by being red. The millipede in the center lives on gray granitic masses on the surface, and it matches that so that it can hide. But in the dark, it doesn't really matter what you look like in terms of visual cues. And so they don't bother to make the pigment, and they save energy that way, which allows them to live in the cave. So the subsurface is one of the least protected of any of the wilderness classes, but this is beginning to change. So for many years, people have dumped trash and other things into caves. They've vandalized them. They've been the recipient of pollution that has been released on the surface. But one of the things that we now know is that a lot of caves and the groundwater that we actually use as humans are really tightly interconnected. And so taking care of our subsurface wilderness area is really important for its conservation value, for its preservation value, wilderness value, but also for our own groundwater sources. And for sure, this is a very important factor in Florida that is paid a lot of attention to. We have unique cave formations where the chemistry of a particular cave, which can be very, very variable between caves, comes together with the metabolic processes of microorganisms to produce amazing structures. And you can see one of my colleagues on the left taking a sample from what looks like fluffy white mud. But this is the interaction of microorganisms that are basically tunneling into the limestone and dissolving it into mush by the organic acids that they produce as a byproduct of their life activities. And this degrades the rock and produces all this fluffy material, which then recrystallizes. The hangy-downy bits called pool fingers on the upper right, these are all in pools where we can see that the mineral deposit processes that go on in mineral saturated waters and the interaction of microbes that grow on these give rise to these extraordinary features. The cave pearls that you see at the bottom in the famous cave Lechuguilla in New Mexico, one of the largest caves in the world, the deepest cave in North America. These look literally like pearls, but we believe that they're produced instead of an ordinary stalagmite that you would see in many caves because they're coated in microorganisms and microorganism biofilm that they produce. Biominerals are something that we're beginning to understand are a big deal on Earth. And work by Bob Hazen, who's a scientist at Carnegie in Washington, D.C., and his team have identified a very small number of what we think of as primitive minerals in the early solar system, in fact, in other solar systems. But we have 4,400, actually it's closer to 4,500 known minerals on Earth today now. And in their work, they've demonstrated that about 1,500 of that 4,500 is due to the presence of water and tectonic mixing that we have in our very active geology on Earth, but that the rest of them are due to the interaction of microorganisms and the chemistry, the geochemistry of the geological setting. So that means that we have a lot of organism produced or organism influenced biominerals that we can identify as signs of life. I want to talk about extreme organisms, and we call them extremophiles, meaning extreme lovers. And these are the key to our understanding, or our hoped for understanding of life on other planets. One of the things that we have learned over the last century is that on Earth, microbial life is everywhere. Here's just a few examples. There is nothing that we live in and amongst that does not have microorganisms all over it, including our inside digestive tract and all over our skin. And this is not a bad thing. If you think of all microorganisms as germs and disease causing, this is not the case. Most of the microorganisms that inhabit us and inside of us are are part of our natural ecosystem. So we and they together, every one of us is an ecosystem in our own right. But even in weird places that have strange chemistries, we find microorganisms. So methane biofilms on rock in the ocean, a lot of the metal corrosion that we see in iron and copper and other metals on Earth's surface, even though this is a chemistry process that would happen anyway, it's greatly enhanced by the presence of microorganisms that get energy out of that. Even in nuclear plant cooling tower water, highly radiation resistant organisms that are able to tolerate those conditions. And I could go on and on. The point is that organisms in this microbial size class are vastly diverse in their chemical talents, far more than we large organisms are. And so this is why they can fit into all the weird environments that we have on Earth, and why we think that they can hopefully fit into weird environments on other planets. So what is an extreme environment? Well, here's that same picture I showed earlier where we're all dressed up in our suits and breathing masks. We define this with respect to ourselves, right? We're very, very focused on people, but what is extreme to us might be home sweet home for the organisms that are highly adapted to that. So we're not looking for organisms that come from somewhere else and are very stressed in this environment. We're looking for organisms that are highly adapted to what we find challenging and perhaps even life-threatening. There are extreme physical and chemical conditions that have to do with temperature and acidity, as I mentioned before, or alkalinity, how salty something is, whether there are potentially toxic metals that we would find toxic in the environment, and many more. So what we think of as extreme here, though, might be an average condition somewhere else. Microbes are small, but they can occur in huge masses. And everything that I show here that I'm not going to individually discuss, because I'm trying to give a broad overview here, but everything that you see in this picture, all these colorful deposits, are the interactions of microbes and the minerals that they deposit or alter. The one I do want to draw your attention to is in the lower left-hand corner. It's that dark lumpy tower that you see. And this is made out of microbes that use minerals containing the element manganese to get some of their energy. And this is a fascinating story because this is in a mine. And the wrinkly stuff you see on the left side of the picture, this is a miner's jacket. And this mine was shut down on a Tuesday in March in 1962. It's an iron mine. And in disgust, a lot of the miners just left, and they left things like their lunch pails and their jackets and other things just in the mine and walked off. And so here we are, 50 years later, not quite, and we are seeing all these microbial formations, and we can actually date how long these have taken to be produced by this microbial activity, because we know when these human artifacts were abandoned. Here's just some more pretty pictures for you to see. Every single one of these is a microbial product working in a mineral environment. The two central bottom images are scanning electron micrographs that show some of the weird shapes of a lot of these organisms. On the surface, we're used to microorganism bacteria, for example, that are relatively simple in shape, like spheres or rod-shaped things and sometimes spirals. But in the subsurface, we have a huge array of different beautiful structures. And my favorites are the stars right there in the middle, these beautiful little mineral stars with a microorganism right at the center of all the star arms. We have life that is conspicuous. So all of the patches of colors that you see in these particular surfaces are all in lava tube caves. So they're all on the rock basalt. But all of these are shining microorganisms that are busy living and making their living in the dark. Many of them are fluorescent, a lot of them shine because they have water beating up on them because they're hydrophobic. A lot of microorganisms will produce these complex hieroglyphic patterns that we can often see. And at first we thought this was some kind of side effect of the fact that we found the first ones in the sulfuric acid cave that I mentioned, but now we've actually been finding them everywhere. We've been finding them not only on cave walls, we found them on the walls of Mayan ruins in Chiapas in Mexico. We found them in Australia on the underside of translucent rocks. We found them in patterns of desert vegetation. And so this patterning is a result of different organisms trying to optimize their access to the resources that they need. And that's a whole other super long story that I don't have time to go into right now. Just to finish up, I want to talk about extraterrestrial caves because we do know a lot more about them than we did a couple of decades ago. When I first started writing about them in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we didn't actually know that there were any. I simply inferred that from first principles, but now we have this wonderful array of holes in the ground on different planets. And this is just an overview of just a very few. You can see on the left there are these big pits, and there are the linear lava tubes, like you can see where the green arrow is pointing to the snake-like feature. You can see the central ones are on the planet Mars, these gigantic holes. You can see even on the bottom of craters on Mercury, which is a super hot planet, and on Venus, these sinuous rills that are lava tube caves, and Io, which is the very volcanically active moon that circles the planet Jupiter, and more. We expect to find them in just about every geologically active body in the solar system. Mars is particularly interesting because, of course, we have aspirations to go there with a continuing series of robotic missions. Other countries are also sending missions. Private companies want to send missions. And ultimately, we want to be able to send humans to the surface of Mars to explore. And a lot of the features that we see on Mars, like this upper left-hand lava bridge, we also have exact counterparts on Earth. The difference is that the examples that we have on Earth are much smaller than the examples that we have on Mars and the Moon. And this is maybe because Mars and the Moon have lower gravitational attraction than the Earth has. We know quite a bit about how these lava tubes form. This shows an active eruption on Mount Etna, which is on the island of Sicily, a part of Italy, that occurred a while ago. This is a very active volcano. And you can see the molten lava through this hole in the rock. And this is flowing at a very high rate and emptying out at the end of this tube structure. When the volcanic eruption stops, then the tube empties out and it leaves this beautiful structure that's actually quite human in scale on Earth. I want to show you one of these Martian cave entrances. It's very tantalizing because we can see sun on that back wall, but this is an enormous feature. This is 100 meters or 300 feet across. And this is a staggering size. I put an American football field on here so that you can get, a feel for that if you're not used to thinking in this size of meters. And we also have non-volcanic caves on Mars, which is something we've only just beginning to look at. This image that you see here is of that same dimension and even more. So this is 300 meters or 900 feet long in the long direction. And this is a fracture in the rock that is not in volcanic terrain. So what kind of life might live in these extraterrestrial caves? This is just a piece of artwork that I was trying to think about. And I was thinking about what kind of life might live in these features. We don't know yet, but we're working our way towards trying to figure it out. Certainly one of the things that's really important is the scale, the size scale that you try to investigate. So the beautiful picture at the top, when I was first shown this back in the early 2000s, I thought it was a Photoshop hoax. Cavers tend to be fairly jokey bunch, and I thought it was a gag, but it turns out that this is actually a real place that we've now studied extensively. So this is a very large end of the scale. In those beautiful white crystals that you see in this very, very hot cave, so we're wearing orange suits because we're packed in ice vests and so forth to try to keep us alive in there. There are microbial forms everywhere. There are some trapped within little pockets of fluid in the crystals. There are some all over those beautiful orange walls that you see. And you can see the lower left, I'm pointing to this complex three-dimensional lacy structure there. That is all created by the microbes that live there. And then a close-up of some of these thread-like microorganisms you can see in the electron microscope picture on the lower right. A lot of the organisms in the subsurface are eaters of rock. And this means that they basically are liberating inorganic chemical sources of energy from the rock. And they then make the rock kind of mushy. We call it punk rock. And these are some from Lechuguilla Cave here in New Mexico, in southern New Mexico, near Carlsbad Caverns. And these are stained with DNA stain. So you can see the cell bodies, they're very tiny, and they're connected by thread-like structures. And this allows them to explore within the rock and begin to mobilize materials that they need in order to support their life. We have been able to grow these guys in the laboratory, all different kinds. So these images just show cellular material, a lot of the circular or oval structures and the star-like structures are all microorganisms. The bushy things are beautiful crystals that the microorganisms are helping to form. So we have spectacular examples on both the macroscopic eyeball scale and also the microscope scale to actually look at these. We have the same sort of thing in lava tube caves, in the Azorian Islands, in Hawaii, in the Mojave Desert, in all different volcanic areas around the world, including New Mexico. And we have mysteries. This is one mystery that I want to share with you as we come to near the end of the talk. These structures that look sort of like mesh stockings, we call them microchoias because cholla cacti have these same sort of beautiful wooden structures as their skeletons. And so that's what it made us think of because a lot of us are New Mexicans and we think of cacti. And, but they are minuscule, they're super tiny. So across one of these little tubes is about a half micrometer. Well, one of your hairs is about 100 micrometers in diameter, right, across your hair. So this is 1/200th the size of the width of one of your hairs. And so this is very, very tiny. Well, we started to find these in caves, and we found them in caves all over the world, as have other people. We are pretty sure that there's some kind of life form, but we do not know what they are, and we've been working for 20 years to try to figure this out. So in that sense, they're kind of like aliens right here on our own planet. They're probably Earth organisms of some sort, but our ability to look for things that are really, really different is quite limited because the more we know about Earth life that we're used to, the more we look more and more carefully and more successfully for that kind of life. But that means that when we come up against something that is radically different like this, that it's very much harder for us to figure out how to figure out what these things are, and we're still working on it. I want to end up with this slide just to let you know what NASA and other space agencies are really focusing on. The Mars exploration is enlarging, so it's not just now NASA and the European Space Agency. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is on their way to a Mars mission. India has aspirations for Mars missions. China has aspirations for Mars missions. The Japanese space agency JAXA is working towards Mars missions. So Mars is going to be very, very well studied. Europa, which circles the moon, it was the moon circling the planet Jupiter, is very tantalizing because we believe it has an interior liquid ocean. And so we're very interested in getting through that ocean or finding places where some of that ocean may have oozed out on the surface and look for signs of life or past life. Enceladus, which is that beautiful white object, third down from the left, that is a moon around Saturn that is poofing out all sorts of vapor plumes. And so plans are afoot to go look and see what's coming out of those vapor plumes. And Titan, this weird, amazing, cold moon, the next fourth one down along my little list of planets, that is a place that looks remarkably Earth-like. And yet it is at super cold temperatures, and the lakes and seas that we see there are not water. The rock is water ice, and the seas and the lakes are actually liquid hydrocarbons. But there may be prebiotic processes that occur there. And we're even understanding that small bodies like big asteroids and cometary bodies may be giving rise to really interesting chemistry. And in fact, even the planet Venus, which is now, extremely hot and very inhospitable to life, early in its history may have had maybe even several billion year period where it would have been habitable. So there are many, many places in our solar system to explore over the next century or so. It's an exciting set of fields for young people to go into. And I can't even express how much joy studying all this stuff has had for me over the years. So with that, let me bring this discussion to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Boston. We really appreciate that. Maybe we can do this, stop sharing.
Yeah, I stopped sharing.
There we go.
Yeah, good.
All right. Thank you so much. We do have quite a few questions from our audience. So the first question we'll see is from, we'll do the, well, first of all, somebody pointed out punk rock. Nice. They like that.
We love it.
There's a question from Lauren Pugi, who is asking, what was it like to be in the caves?
I love being in caves, and I had no idea I would love being in caves. And I have to tell you a story from the first cave I went into, which was, the first wild cave I ever went into. I mean, we trained to do vertical work up and down ropes for about 4 hours. And the three of us on the NASA team were all newbies at the time. This was back in 1994. And we went in with some experienced cavers. And, this was Lechuguilla Cave, one of the biggest caves in the world. A very, very hard cave to go into. And the whole time I was in there for 5 continuous days, that's how big the cave is, none of us had the skills in our team. We had never done wild caving, and we had no idea how to move in this complicated 3-dimensional way. And I just kept thinking the whole time, I had been in, difficult conditions before. I just have to live long enough to get out of here. And I got a chunk of rock in my eye, and it swelled up, and then I got chip of rock smashed into my shin, and it got swollen up, and I couldn't take my boot off. And we finally got out, and we were all covered with massive bruises because we were really not up to this expedition. And the cavers probably should have known this, but you know, they were good cavers, so they didn't realize how hard it would be for us. But when I got out, things started to heal, and I realized that I'd been in a place that was completely unlike anything I had ever experienced. And you know, the pain fades, right? Humans are very adaptable, which is why we, you know, have more than one kid, right? And then I realized that I needed to learn how to do this safely so that I could really do this. And I was totally hooked, totally hooked.
Wow. That sounds really scary but exciting at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
So we do have a question from Chloe Claire, and she was asking, what do you think about the recent discovery of phosphine on Venus?
Well, you know, that's a subject near and dear to my heart. We just finished a big study, a NASA-funded study that includes a spectrum of folks from NASA, from universities, small companies and stuff, looking at a Venus flagship mission, which means a big Venus mission that can do a lot of things. And my part of it is an aerobot, which is a variable altitude balloon carrying a fluorescence microscope and a number of chemistry instruments to try to look for any life signs actually within that cloud deck, 50 to about 60 kilometer altitude above the surface of Venus. The temperatures are much milder. And I think it's a long shot. I think the phosphine detection obviously still has to be vetted. Even the authors themselves of that paper say, we think this is phosphine, but this is really hard stuff to analyze. And what do you guys think? So that has to be checked out. And then not all phosphine comes from biology. Certainly a lot of it on our planet, we now understand does. But there are phosphine on other planetary bodies. So it's a baby step. It's a potentially exciting baby step, but science is very, very careful. And so we try not to jump to conclusions and try to be very rigorous about how we approach trying to show that maybe it's not really phosphine, or if it's phosphine, maybe there's a bunch of other ways you can make phosphine besides life. But it sure has created a lot of interest. So those of us who are big Venus fans, it's like, go Venus. We're thrilled.
When was the last mission, do you remember, that actually went to Venus? Or that
Well,
was focused on it?
we have not really done serious Venus stuff in a really long time. So late 90s, and then there have been a Russian mission more recently, but Venus is way understudied as objects in the solar system are. It's not easy to study Venus. You know, it's fairly close, but gosh, you know, you need hot tech, right? You need tech that can tolerate surface temperatures and the acidity in the environment. And so there are a lot of challenges technologically in approaching Venus. We think that our study is one set of good ideas. There are plenty of other good ideas that have been proposed about how to do that. And I think that the interest in Venus is increasing. And I think we will see more missions very soon.
Well, I hopefully this new kind of discovery will help kind of promote this mission.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
Another question is, how are you able to determine the number of caves without openings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the early attempts to figure out how many caves there were in the world were, you know, caves with openings that people had found and mapped and so forth. A lot of the way we try to figure that out is really from drilling. So extractive industries like hard rock mining and oil exploration. A lot of oil exploration is in cave-rich areas, because the fact that there are holes in the rock not only makes wonderful caves, but also provides a reservoir for the accumulation of petroleum. So the presence of petroleum and the presence of caves are very often conjoined. And so a lot of that estimate of 100 to 10,000 times is based on how much space you can calculate from a big rock column that gets drilled out. So a big borehole gets drilled, and people who are looking for resources, of course, are looking for that, but they log that. And so you can look at how much space you've got, and you can try to analogize that with similar geological settings and calculate it that way.
Okay. There's another question about, do they need oxygen? And I think they're referring to the microorganisms on the cave walls that made those patterns.
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, no, and maybe. I mean, it depends on who. So there's zillions and zillions of microbes. And, some of them need oxygen like we do. Some of them are actually poisoned by oxygen. Anaerobes are sometimes poisoned by oxygen. There are microorganisms that can either take oxygen or leave it. And it really depends on the nature of them, and it depends on the nature of the cave. So there are some caves with certainly Earth normal levels of oxygen. And then there are caves that have very little oxygen. There are caves and cavities below the surface of the Earth, many not having natural openings, where you have essentially anaerobic conditions. So it's really all over that spectrum of from no oxygen to Earth normal oxygen.
All right. So then we have another question about caving. Does it feel like another world inside the caves?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, when I was a tiny kid and I just started reading science fiction really early, I mean, I totally wanted to get into my rocket ship and go, because I didn't understand the physics at the time. I didn't know how limited we were. And I wanted to go bop around the galaxy, and look for stuff with tentacles and cool animal-like things and weird plants and stuff, and weird landscapes. And so my brain has never really grown up. That's what I still want to do. And caves are the closest I've ever been to that. A lot of the caves I've been to, particularly the ones with strange, challenging geochemical and atmosphere circumstances. It's really, it's really a different world. And if you are in a very large cave, you go in for quite a number of days in order to actually get to the sites to study. So also you have this total human sensory shift. You can see, if you're a sighted person, you can see, but you're relying on your cave lights, and you don't have wind on your skin, and your senses of smell, adapts to what's in the cave. And it's just such a different transformative experience. I love it.
What do you have any advice for anybody who, especially that is interested in kind of becoming a cave explorer? Like how did you get started, or how to get started?
All over the country, and in fact, all over the world, there are caving clubs. And in the United States, a lot of these are affiliated with the National Speleological Society, which is a big caving organization that people belong to. They're called grottos. There's a ton of them in Florida. There's a ton of them everywhere. And that's a great way to be introduced to caves. A lot of them will have beginner trips, cavers are really a pretty friendly bunch and very interested in sharing their passions and sharing their techniques and teaching about safety and stuff. So, looking up the National Speleological Society and then kind of searching for cave clubs in whatever area you're in is a great way to get started. They will welcome you with open arms.
Cool. All right, so we have another question from Dr. Dan Batchelor. Hi, Dan. Is it thought that terrestrial extremophiles adapted to extreme environments from earlier species that originated in a less extreme environment? or did the speciation occur early in Earth's history?
Wow, that's a great question, and we don't know, but we have a lot of thoughts. So I think that the answer is yes, both. And so there's clearly some portion of the microbiome that you can relate to surface organisms that clearly have gotten into the subsurface at some point and been able, some small proportion of them, been able to adapt to the radically conditions that you find in the subsurface. That's not surprising, but in many places we have genotypes that are not closely related to anything other than organisms found in other subsurface habitats. And in some of these cases, it can be caves on a totally different continent, or organisms associated with deep sea hydrothermal vents. So I don't expect to live long enough to see this idea really tested, but my belief is that when we see that, we're seeing an indigenous native microbiota that has been in the subsurface for a very long time, if not forever. Some people have even suggested that subsurface environments might have been more conducive to, some of the early prebiotic chemistry that would have been sensitive to early high levels of ultraviolet from the early baby sun and the lack of an ozone layer. I have no idea whether that's the case, but I think that because these organisms live very slowly on a very low energy budget, that we are looking at the result of maybe the supercontinental cycle where, land masses come together and then separate apart. Land masses on the continents get, pulled apart and stuck onto another land mass. And this happens about every 500 million years or so in the history of Earth. And so I actually think that a lot of these organisms get dragged around with that and that they're never on the surface. So that's one of the things that gives me hope that maybe that is a viable model for life being restricted to the subsurface of somewhere like Mars without a modern surface biosphere, or in an icy moon with an interior ocean, which I don't think of as an ocean planet. I think of it as a water-filled cave planet because it's closed, right? It's a closed system, or a largely closed system with, water on the inside. So, if that's possible, you have to think about how these organisms would get energy and how they would get around in such a body. So that is a very speculative thing, but I truly believe it.
Interesting. And then we have one last question from the audience, but if you guys do have questions, do feel free to share. We can answer a few more. Dr. Boston, what do you think about the possible evidence of fossilized microbes in Martian meteorites?
I love this question because it's complicated and it's really a lesson in science. So in 1996, based on earlier material that had been studied for a few years, that we now know is a Martian meteorite, meaning that some large objects have smashed into all of the planets. And sometimes these objects are so huge that they actually blast pieces off the planet or moon that they slam into. And some of that escapes and goes somewhere else. And so we have a number of these objects called SNCC meteorites on Earth that clearly came from Mars. And we know this because we understand the Mars atmosphere. And a lot of these meteorites have gases trapped in little pockets within them. And they match both not only the chemical composition, but also the isotopic values of what we understand to be the Mars atmosphere. So this is why we think they come from Mars. And the Mars meteorite that is being talked about is one of those. And so when it was first published, it had half a dozen lines of evidence that all pointed to it containing remnants of life. And the lesson that we've learned is that one by one, each one of those lines of evidence have now been successfully challenged and shown to be also potentially created by non-life. So each line of evidence is much weaker than originally thought. It may still represent remnants of Mars life, but it's not a clean case. And what it shows is that life is such a complex phenomenon that even when you think you've got a lot of evidence, trying to bring those together and then having that subjected to rigorous challenges as is the procedure in science, where we challenge each other and challenge ourselves all the time, has shown that it's not a slam dunk. And so that really has advanced the sophistication of our thinking, I think. I also think that these meteorites have been through a lot. Okay, so that first of all, a big thing slams into the parent planet. All that stuff gets, spread around. It hangs out in space with all the space weathering and high radiation and desiccation and stuff for millions of years. And then it eventually, slams into Earth and has to undergo all that superheating of the crust of the object before it lands. And then in the case of many of these meteorites, they've sat around for 10 or 20,000 years or more on the surface before somebody finds them. So they've been through a lot. So I think the best way for us to answer whether or not ALH 84001, which is burned into our brains as the meteorite that this was reported for, is to actually go to Mars and study stuff there. And then maybe we'll be able to answer someday whether or not what we see in that meteorite is really any indication of former life.
Would this require humans to go there and study this, or is this somehow be able to done with rovers or something, or remotely?
Well, I think both. I mean, one of the issues that we face when we send humans is, we are, as I said before, we're all covered inside and out with microbes. We need that. That's the way we're supposed to be. But it means that everything that we interact with, of course, is contaminated by those microbes. And so we want to not damage our ability to tell if something is really Martian or human associated brought from Earth. And we also don't want to do anything to threaten any indigenous life forms on another biosphere. So that's called planetary protection, and we worry about it a lot. And there are international bodies that worry about it and make policy, and NASA worries about it and has an Office of Planetary Protection. And in fact, I just gave a briefing to the National Academy of Sciences yesterday on planetary protection. So we take it super, super seriously. So humans can do a lot more than robots can do right now. But we have to do a lot of advancement before we can sustain humans safely on the surface of Mars in terms of their life support for long periods of time. And we also have to take care of this planetary protection consideration. So there's a lot to do to prepare for humans there. Ultimately, I anticipate that we'll see that. And humans definitely are our best scientific instrument at this point.
It looks like we have one last question from Kathy, which says, have the genetic makeup of these extremophiles been done? And so what have we learned from them?
Well, that's a long story. I'll try to make it as short as possible. The answer is they're staggeringly numerous. So doing a full genomic workup on any of them is not feasible yet, although it's becoming more feasible, right? So I'm sure that many of you know that the technology of investigating the genetic material is still essentially on an almost exponential curve in terms of the capability that we have, the speed with which that can be done, and the price going down. And so some of them have indeed been looked at. And what I was saying before about who is related to who, and some of these organisms being only related to other organisms in the subsurface, that all comes from the genomic that we have done. Dr. Diana Northup at the University of New Mexico is one of my chief collaborators. She does a lot of that work. There are a number of other microbiologists that specialize in cave phylogenetic work. And but the issue is that the biodiversity is so huge that we still are just barely scratching the surface of that. And what we've learned from them is that, boy, are they diverse. Whole new phyla have been discovered of microorganisms that we have no representatives of on the surface. And so that whole complex genetic tree that you see of bacteria and archaea and eukarya, that is just ballooning in terms of what we're finding in the subsurface, to the point where we can't even handle it all. And I believe that we seriously need advanced machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence to help us chew through this data.
So it's kind of like a whole new world, right?
Yes.
In our own little world.
It is. I mean, I've often thought recently that, if I were a young person entering into a career, I would be very tempted to go into computational biology, mathematical biology, to try to tackle this big data problem that we have in machine learning and artificial intelligence worlds.
All right. So I think that for now, that looks like all the questions that we have. I'm going to stick around and give a couple of announcements, but is there one last thing you want to say before I go on to?
It's been delightful to talk to you all, even though I can't talk to you all. And I much prefer delivering talks in person because I like to talk to people. And I love to have an audience, but I know you're all out there, and I'm really pleased that you were interested enough to join us in this brave new world of pandemic online everything. So thanks for the invitation, Saida, and everybody. And it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk and I learned a lot myself. So we actually have a couple student clubs here on campus, and they've put together a virtual space, including our Student Astronomical Society, the Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, and our Astrobiological Research and Education Society. And so with you, with the audience in the on YouTube, the link to the virtual space is located in the description of the video, but I will share it with you if you would like to join us. So several of our students are already in the room, so it allows for a less formal interaction with the students, and there are some stuff about Martian regolith and things like that. So, and also I should mention that tomorrow is International Observe the Moon Night, and in honor of that, we've created a virtual moons of the solar system that would be available tonight, which again is in the link of the YouTube video. I'll give a brief kind of tour of that right now. Let's see. So you guys should be able to see it. So this is a 360-degree tour of the solar system, and in here we have several of the planets that would be visible in the solar system. And so if you go to the first scene after that, we have our own moon. And we have some interesting features on the moon that you can learn more about the moon, where the moon landing occurred. You can try to find the Earth somewhere in here. There it is. Um, and if we go to another one, this is actually the surface of the moon. So again, this is something that you can explore yourself. This is a visualization of what the moon looks like near the Apollo 11 landing. And then we have moons of Mars, because we're not the only planet that has moons. So Mars has moons, so it's Phobos and Deimos. Jupiter has several moons, and a lot of them are very interesting, especially is it Europa? That's the frozen, one of the frozen ones, with a potential ocean. And then we also have Saturn, who surprisingly enough currently has the highest count for moons, more so than Jupiter. And it has Titan, which Dr. Boston mentioned, and we also have Enceladus here. So please enjoy, and hopefully it's an interesting learning experience. And we hoped that we see you guys in the Mozilla room. So many of you looks like you've joined, so hopefully we'll see you there. All right, everyone, have a good evening and enjoy